In this video, we're going to talk about kind of unconventional geothermal or just other uses than actually generating power. Because again, to get to the point where you can start to push electrons down a wire, you need pretty hot water. That's not something that we have everywhere. One interesting application is something that's called enhanced geothermal. So first of all, to think about how the plumbing of a geothermal system works, we don't really control that, right? That's geologic materials. And for the water to get down to the heat source and get back to the surface, we have to have really good kind of these two things we like to focus on. So if we want that to be an effective pathway from rainwater down to the heat source back to the surface, we have to have, first of all, really good porosity, and second of all, really good permeability. So these two things are a measurement of how effectively water can travel through the earth, right? So again, the oil and gas people are always talking about porosity and permeability. Oftentimes those aren't in our favor, and we saw, again, thinking about the oil and gas folks, a way that they get around it. And that's the F word, right? If you can think back to however many weeks ago that was when we talked about that. So the solutions they had in the oil world were to go in with high pressure and pop those rocks open. And they could pull the materials out that they were interested in. Well, here we just want the heat. So we kind of can do the same thing. So first of all, I think kind of full disclosure, there's a couple of companies that have gone bankrupt trying this, but the math works out. So no one is doing this yet, but there are a few places where it's possible to do. So here we've got the surface of the earth, and we're gonna have a heat source down here. Let's say it's a package of igneous rocks that cooled off, 10 million years ago. And so they're still really hot, but they're crystalline, they're solid rocks. So what we could do is we could go down, we could drill into them, just like we had done in the previous discussion of this, and use high pressure. And heck, we could probably even use explosives because we're not worried about extracting anything. We just want to smash the rock up. So we can shatter the rock. And in that case, as we shatter the rock, and remember, this rock is hot, so we shatter it, get it all smashed up. I'm just drawing lots of fractures here. I'm just going to keep drawing fractures. And so at this point, we're not really concerned with fracking chemicals. We're not using proppant, although maybe that would be useful. So now that we've got our fracked hot rock, we can actually put in another well over here that's essentially our extraction well. And so at this point, all we would need to do is to just inject pure water. We could actually just take good old H2O, shove it down into this side of the hole. That water is going to get heated up by my big hot mess here. Kind of looks pretty jumbled in my drawing, but that water will work its way through and pick up heat from these rocks. Now, the amount of heat that rocks contain is really high, and rocks have a really high heat capacity. So this is not something that would diminish in the short term. You probably get quite a few years out of this. And then at that point, you can just pull the water out. And if your heat source is strong enough, you've got hot water and you can run a geothermal power plant. So you basically just made a heat exchanger out of the earth. So that's what we call enhanced geothermal. I think it's a really cool engineering idea. But like I said, everyone who's tried this has gone bankrupt. So we'll see if that works in the future. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is really kind of Boise's contribution, right? We're a little bit famous in this realm, in the geothermal realm, believe it or not. And we have low temperature, or what we could also call direct use geothermal. So the water that's coming out of our system, again, here's that picture of kind of our mountain block recharge geothermal system in Idaho. It recharges up in the Boise front, we'll call mountain block recharge. It infiltrates down through the Idaho batholith. It hits the Boise front fault system and comes up, kind of most notably over in the Fort Boise area, not too far from Warm Springs Boulevard. And That's been the case for a long time. So the very early settlers in Boise, there was a small little resort built kind of right in the nook over by the prison before the prison existed, and people would go there and relax. Not too long after that, we actually built this palatial building. This is the natatorium, right? It doesn't look like this anymore. It's now we call it the hydrotube. Still, some people call it the natatorium. This was a geothermally heated swimming pool, recreational pool, back before we had heated swimming pools, right? So this was really special, gorgeous building. It burnt down in a fire, sadly. But kind of thinking about the history of low temperature and direct use, this is the interior of a greenhouse over off of Hill Road. You may have been there. It's named after a guy. His name is Edward. So this is inside of Edward's greenhouse. That's a family-owned greenhouse. We actually I know the girl who's next in line. She's fourth generation. But you can see when you look on the inside of Edward's greenhouse, there's all of these pipes, these old metal pipes. And those are tied to a geothermal well. And so they're pulling hot water out of the ground and running it through like a radiator and just using that to heat the air rather than to create electricity. That's the key of low temp or direct use. You're kind of using it like a radiator. So I mentioned Boise. We've got a pretty big history in this. You can see here, this is at the Boise Watershed Interpretive Center. The Boise Artesian and Cold and Hot Water Company, or Hot and Cold Water Company, excuse me. This was the company that, many years ago, 100 years ago, turn of the century, and even kind of up into the 20s, they would supply you with hot water and cold water. It turns out there's a really interesting kind of history of this company. Eventually it split into two companies. One took the hot water side, one took the cold water side. The hot water side is now the kind of Boise Geothermal System. It's an association. The cold water side has changed names quite a few times, but the current name is Suez, right? That's your water company. They started literally as part of the system. So this is the depressing looking beating heart of the Boise Geothermal low temp direct use system. This is actually inside of a little shack right next to the new mountain bike park over by St. Luke's Hospital in downtown Boise. And what's happening here is the hot water is pulled out of the ground. You can see these pipes are heavily insulated. And from there, it's piped off to various places in the city. Now, what makes this unique, when you're a customer of the Boise Geothermal System, you don't actually get the water. They bring the water to you and they take the water back. It's up to you to actually use what's called the heat exchanger or a closed loop system. So if we were to imagine, here's where, so we'll draw the surface of the land here and put a building right there. So the hot water comes out, the little station where they meter it, and they run it underground because it keeps it thermal, right? It keeps it insulated. And then they'll bring it into your building. But at that point, you have to have a separate loop in your building of water, and there's a heat exchanger that passes the heat from the water into your building system. I know that sounds pretty goofy, but you can see here, this is a type of heat exchanger right here. This is called a plate exchanger, and it has 4 ports, right? One is in and out of one system and one is in and out of another system, and never do the two groups of water ever meet one another. So water travels through every other layer of one system, and then the other system, the water travels through every other layer. Kind of like a half shuffled deck of cards, right? They're all between one another. And so in this case, the Boise Geothermal System might be selling you water that comes in at 200 degrees C. I think there's this a little bit colder. I think it's like 180 actually, but we'll use 200 to keep the numbers. And then when the water leaves your area, it might be coming out at 160 degrees Celsius. And that difference, that 40 degrees of Celsius, you used in your own system here in your building. And so when you see this symbol, you'll see the symbol all over downtown Boise. This is heated geothermal. That means that building has a closed loop of water or sometimes another fluid as well, like propylene or something mixed in with the water. And they're extracting the heat, and then Boise Geothermal is taking their water back, and you're left with the heat. And so one of the cool things is this really depends on, so I've talked to some of the folks over there, this really depends on how much money you spend on a heat exchanger. So some buildings will get the water at 200, and just using hypothetical numbers, it goes back at 180. They didn't take very much heat. But others will put the water back at like 120. They bought a really expensive heat exchanger. So it's kind of different, like I said, for all users. The Owyhee, which is a building in downtown Boise, there's the Owyhee Tavern on the ground floor. It's kind of maybe like 11th and Main, kind of in that area. Not too far from the Neurolux Bar, the Record Exchange, that end of downtown. The Owyhee, they're one of the most recent additions to the Boise geothermal system, and they have a really nice heat exchanger. They actually take enough energy out of the water that they have run a network of pipes under the sidewalk. So in the winter, if you're ever walking in downtown Boise, that's a great block to walk on because the sidewalks are never icy. They're actually heated with Boise geothermal because they have a nice heat exchanger. So this is a diagram kind of maybe looks a little bit more abstract. You can see here we got kind of on the left side the hot water source, and then that hot water is pumped along. It looks like there's Manzanita Estates and Warren Estates in the top. Each of those has a closed loop, right? And then the system goes off, and that groundwater is usually recharged or shoved back into the ground. I ran out of memory card yesterday, so excuse me for the quick costume change. But just to get back to what we were talking about, you can see here in this map, this is an image of the Boise geothermal distribution system. There's a few different colors here, so you can see it's color coded. That's kind of coded to usage, right, or user group. There's some residential shown in green. Government buildings are shown in blue. And again, you can see this little logo when you're downtown. And so the way that the Boise geothermal system works, as we've talked about before, and we've seen some of these other images, they send you the water, you take the heat out. The interesting thing about this is that this map is out of date, and I've seen the up-to-date one. I can't seem to find it anywhere online. The stuff that's out of date is actually Boise State is now on the geothermal system. That's been the case since approximately 2015. So in the area of St. Luke's Hospital, kind of in the northern part of this map, you can see a small area labeled supply wells. And then that's where the hot water is coming out of that fault system, running through the system. And then the injection wells, there's one over in Julia Davis Park. And actually also you can follow this kind of little purple stringer out to Ann Morrison Park. So that water is injected back into the ground. In this case, it's away from the heat source, so it just becomes part of the aquifer. They're not reusing it like we saw in some other cases. And actually, I believe prior to 1992, that water just went directly into the Boise River, which we now know you don't want to change water temperatures, and we really kind of understand a little bit more about requirements for things living in the water. So pouring in hot water is not a very good idea.